I've already shown you the second language I've ever made, which all in all I'm fairly satisfied with. There are some things that are not exactly up to Poyo's standards, but perfect is the enemy of good, and I'd rather move on to a new project. But I figured it's only fair that I show you my first language, which is, let's just say nothing to write home about. To match its quality, today's presentation is on cardboard. Whenever I see people making videos on their first languages, oftentimes it's the same song and dance. I got really into linguistics, started reading Wikipedia articles on obscure features found in languages no one's ever heard of, and felt compelled to mash them into my language, creating a bloated monster that's practically unusable. This was not the case for me, in fact, quite the opposite. I didn't really feel the need to research ergative absolutive alignment, polypersonal agreement, or inverse number, because I couldn't care less about Georgian, Fijian, or Native American languages spoken by 40 people of the Puffy Coochie tribe in the middle of the Arizona desert. To be honest with you, it's very difficult for me to get interested in a language unless it's associated with pop culture featuring a lot of young, attractive women. So the issue with my language wasn't an overabundance of incongruent features, it was a lack of inspiration, or rather that my inspiration was very unilateral. But before I elaborate on that, I want to talk about what got me into constructed languages to begin with. And for that, we need to go back in time till late 2014. And no, we're not counting this thing that I made when I was 5. Anyway, I just started high school, and just like most other unpopular kids, I developed an interest in anime. At the same time, because this was my first time at a public school, all my classmates were dogshit at English, at least compared to me. This really stroked my ego and made me think I have some sort of a talent for languages. And when you're a weeb and also a linguist, you know where that inevitably leads you. Cross-dressing. Oh, and also learning Japanese, I guess. Originally, I was only interested in the writing system, but I soon realized that it's kind of difficult to use without actually knowing how to put together sentences, so I decided to learn some grammar too. And to be honest, I didn't care much for it. It felt unnecessarily complicated in some aspects and overly simplistic in others. But if there was one good thing that I took away from it, it was the realization that languages can be quite diverse in how they're structured. The other catalyst for my language creation endeavors was my discovery of Esperanto. Now, just to be clear, I don't like Esperanto. You won't catch me saying that. There's plenty of issues with it, from its many unnecessary features to its ridiculous orthography, although my main problem with it is that I think it sounds awful. It's like Spanish with a Czech accent. Yuck. What I do like about Esperanto is the idea behind it. Not the world peace thing, I don't give a shit about that. I like the idea of min-maxing a language. As someone who likes to think that they have an eye for aesthetics, I like neatness, minimalism, elegance, and most of all, symmetry. And natural languages are the antithesis of all of these things. They're messy and oftentimes frustratingly illogical. And so the idea of designing a fine-tuned, clean language from scratch satisfied my non-existent OCD. I mean, look at this. This comes. And I said earlier that I wasn't initially a fan of Japanese grammar, but there were things I liked about it. For some reason, I was floored at the idea of particles. I evidently thought it was the most genius linguistic mechanism imaginable, even though they do exactly the same thing as noun cases, they're just separate words. And most of all, I really like the fun aesthetics of Japanese. It has some words that go way harder than they have any right to. And so around the summer of 2015, I thought to myself, what if I make my own language, which would combine the simplicity and elegance of Esperanto structures with the sound of Japanese, which was so pleasant to my ear. And so the first version of my language was made. You heard that right. I did do something that many budding language creators resort to. I rebuilt the whole project from scratch. 5 times. This is actually the sole reason why I decided it was worth making a video about it. If you look at any of these versions in isolation, they're not very interesting. But if you look at them together, they tell a story. You can look at the subsequent versions of the language and trace back the steps of my venture into the world of linguistics. You'll see that, as I was getting more familiar with Japanese, I would include more and more of its features in my language. And you'll also notice that at some point I started learning Korean, and my infatuation with it left very conspicuous marks on certain versions of the language. So let's look at each version one by one and see what they have to offer. The first version of the language is more of a sketch. I mean, it didn't even have a name. This was the first time I had attempted to create a language, so I had basically no idea what I was doing, but I figured phonology, or as I called it in the original file, phonetics, was a good place to start. I didn't put too much thought into it. It was basically just Japanese with VL and a velar nasal coda, and without geminates, iotation, and long vowels. I didn't know IPA at the time, so I added these weird phonetic guides. You can also see that I was clearly inspired by Pinyin, if you look at the way I romanized ch and sh. For some ungodly reason, I actually stuck with this terrible convention even in the final version of the language. Anyway, most of the grammar is basically nondescript European slop. The tense system copies my native Polish because I found English tenses stupid and overcomplicated. The passive voice is obviously copula plus passive participle, and the other verb forms are equally unremarkable. I copied the Esperanto correlative table and added nothing of value to it, and made a table of personal pronouns that all sound the same, and inflect for gender even though there's no signs of gender existing anywhere else in the language. I also somehow managed to accidentally replicate the Swahili noun class system without knowing that Swahili was a language and not the name of a dish. As to the features I copied from Japanese, those included particles, which again all sound the same, the agglutinative structure of 2+ digit numbers, the use of nouns instead of adpositions to indicate relative positions, and the endings of verbs and adjectives. Throw in some unimaginative conjunctions, unimaginative comparatives and superlatives, and that's basically the first draft of my language in a nutshell. I also experimented with a Japanese-style mixed script, but with Hangul instead, although I never properly formalized it. The language was bad and boring, but not terrible for a first attempt. The second version is when I actually made something that could be called a functional language. I wrote it down on a website and holy shit, you can clearly see I was going through my CSS phase. All in all, it's pretty much an extension of the first language that's much more comprehensive, better sounding, and with an actual dictionary. And my god, was it a dictionary with a capital D. I will say having a total of 3,500 words would be quite impressive if it weren't for the fact that almost all of them were pulled from thin air and had absolutely no etymology behind them. Sure, it makes perfect sense to have separate roots for like 50 names of flowers. Why did I feel compelled to make up all of these? When would I even use them? Anyway, some changes from the first version of the language included me learning IPA, getting rid of L and V, not using capital letters, based, using an auxiliary verb as a passive suffix, actually defining at least some derivational rules, and getting rid of the only interesting feature of the language, i.e. the accidental noun classes. I figured having all, for example, animals ending in the same syllable was not something I was a fan of, so I only kept 2 classes around. So in the end, all nouns denoting people ended in the same syllable anyway, and so did all nouns describing time and place. I also gave the language a name. I'm not good at naming my languages. My second one is literally called Language, and so will my third one if I ever make it. In my first project, I was a little more creative, so I named it My Language. The third version likely happened because I started learning Korean, and I really liked it. Obviously, it wouldn't inspire me to change my language structurally because Japanese and Korean are typologically basically the same language, so it's not like it had anything fresh to offer in that regard, which meant making my language more like Korean boiled down to making it sound more like Korean. I added a bunch of codas, a couple new vowels, and even had some allophones. Ain't that something? I have to admit that I was way too obsessed with getting my language to sound exactly the way I wanted, and neglected other aspects of the language. Even at this point, I did realize that morphosyntactically, the language had close to zero actual substance, but I couldn't figure out how to reform it, save for extremely superficial changes such as adding Spanish question marks. And it makes sense, the language was based on an existing set of structures, so I couldn't really make it anything else without rebuilding it from scratch. And I wasn't going to do that. All that each new revision came with was mindless labor, because I would rewrite the entire reference grammar without any substantial changes. Well, I did make one change that was actually interesting. I once again entertained the idea of implementing a mixed script, but this time it would be the opposite of how Japanese writing works. Japanese encodes content words logographically and function words phonographically. Because of this, it employs thousands of logographs because there are a lot of content words. My idea was to encode function words with logographs and the rest with an alphabet. Because functional morphology is a closed set, the number of logographs would be limited to a few dozen, and the vastly more plentiful and ever-growing set of content words would be spelled phonetically, meaning however many new words I came up with, I wouldn't have to add more characters. This was actually a creative and innovative idea, so of course what I did is I ditched it in the subsequent versions of the language. I really am my worst enemy. You can also tell I was doing driver's ed at the time because I decided to make a few custom road signs. If only I put this much effort into actually learning how to drive, I might have had a license by now. I made the fourth version of the language at the peak of my infatuation with Korean. Not only was it spelled fully in Hangul, the phonology was basically just Korean with a few vowels and aspirates removed. All the allophony was almost identical to Korean as well. But most importantly, at this point I was familiar enough with the grammatical structure of Japanese, and by extension Korean, that I decided to make a switch from European slop to Japanese relax. Of course, I still didn't include features that I considered stupid, most of which I still hate by the way, but once I felt comfortable with the word order, I found that it was pretty easy to put together sentences. And looking back at it, it makes sense. The language is very consistently head final, leaving little ambiguity as to where to place words in relation to each other. In the previous version, I renamed particles to conjunctions, and this time I didn't even class them as a separate category. I just called them noun case suffixes, and made different forms depending on the ending of the preceding noun, because you guessed it, Korean. I merged verbs and adjectives into one part of speech. In Korean that's almost the case, they're barely different. I also apparently went back on my original idea of making the language 100% regular, just to feel something I guess. I developed a few valency changing operations, which happens not only in Korean and Japanese, but also our old friend Esperanto, although in all these cases it's done with stem alternations or infixes, and I had the decency to use auxiliary verbs. I ripped off the strategy of forming imperatives with an auxiliary give from, you guessed it. I implemented a locative copula different from the regular copula and I made attributive forms which looked almost exactly like Korean ones. And obviously subordinate clauses are now head final because everything else is. Also, conjunctions don't exist anymore. Now we have converbs. One of my quirky ideas was to allow for Sinitic borrowings. This was because I noticed the similarity between Sino-Korean and Cantonese character readings. I went through a whole bunch of them and tried to figure out what patterns they followed, and then regularized them in a table. Never mind that I established this entire system just to borrow like 5 words, but whatever. Looking at the website, I was also clearly inspired by Premier League branding. Actually, this is a nice palette, I should use it in a video. By the time I decided to remake my language for the 5th time, my honeymoon phase with Korean had ended, and I was now in a healthy love triangle with both Japanese and Korean, so to balance things out, I wanted to make the final version a nice even split between both languages. But the real impetus for this iteration was my discovery of a little feature hidden deep in the abyss of Windows keyboard settings. As it turns out, you can actually input old Hangul letters and make functional syllable blocks with them. Holy Mother of God. This allowed me to add a bunch of diphthongs and triphthongs into the language, 2 consonants absent from Korean, and a bunch of double consonants. I even introduced some codas that don't occur in either language. How brave of me. Anyway, I didn't add much to the language structure-wise, but particles are back from the gulag. The funniest thing I did, though, I realized my word formation rules were basically garbage, and if I wanted to put together more than 2 morphemes, the resultant words would get ludicrously long. So, what I did, and get ready for this, is that for every root in the language, there is an additional monosyllabic morpheme that can be used in compounds. Does that sound familiar? Here, maybe this will help. The key difference is that in Japanese and Korean, it makes sense for historical reasons, while I just pulled my examples out of my ass. To be fair, it does work effectively, but for all the wrong reasons. I don't have much to add, so I'll just read you an example sentence in all 5 versions so you can see how the language quote-unquote evolved. 와 알랑타야 마양푸 이 하나치 데테웨 이타 우수시. 와 유라타야 유라미 유코야치 오노에 이타 우수시. 와 친구타야 친구미 유아마 는데 치미타 우수시. 와리 메이에 쿠마 쿠부사 무리 우순나. 와리 메이에 쿠마 쿠나부사 머리 우순나. And here's a longer text in the final version. 몬바레르 워리 페코로의 질기를 초마 주별 지오에 거의대 관나. 길이 밤지그러서 아스테 무구각을 무금이려 오야 백화 지와대 느르나 자유 워리 뉴리 야레야 사케야멘나. 길이 오야 늘시시 저수 오야 오야수 정히나다가 초마 무초시 비체르 워리 제 기루 바로 양어라고 가효는나. 길이 오예 유리 시스카라게 구 지보테 워리 아이스 페커 구몬나. 길이 고쿠마 이술 야사드나 부사 워리 게 하지시멘나 페커 구 집었나. 길이 흔테신나고 문하다가 제자 코에 흐리하라 릭트나부사 워리 코에 조마 묻었나. 워리 키아시시테 코에 흐라 이집별 길이 사케세 그 없술레고 디기나다가 길이 이미다야 페코라 그 없수테 어이 훌수 릭든나. 도심순 워리 키아 류나몬지술 세구시테 길이 학세있나. 코에 튠닉이 워리 유짐 것을 흐르르나지 나가요 법초술 주분나. 제자 길이 와리 유아치고 양어라. 못대 워들이 다야다술 과때 모치 율기미라나부사 워리 수있나. 각을 간분 다 자나리 스비오드테 오에 워들이 왜다 하자했나 아리 워리 휴나이스니라 그 묻나. 다가 길이 흔테테 아마술 오이나부사 워리 키에 눅스라 총때 코에 튠니가 미불부사 하갑별 캬 받아는나. 집술 워리 아니고 페코라라 그 도항은.